Pontius Pilate. Interesting name. Who named their son Pontius? Pontius Pilate is the Roman procurator. What that is essentially is a military governor. He was in charge of building up the infrastructure as a governor would in a province, but he also controlled the military. So all the Roman soldiers were under Pilate's jurisdiction. Scripture portrays Pilate as being this sympathetic man, this compassionate man when it comes to Jesus.
How can I help you?
History tends to show us otherwise. A lot of crucifixions, a lot of bloodshed was done under Pilate's watch.
Die!
Now the Sanhedrin couldn't convict Jesus. Why would the Sanhedrin want Jesus gone? Coming out of the Gospel of John, it's better for one man to die so that a nation can survive. If you remember back, one of the very first lessons I ever taught you was that the Sadducees were in league with Rome. The Romans made a deal with the Sadducees that said you can keep your power, you can keep your influence, you can keep your wealth as long as you help us maintain peace. The Sadducees viewed Jesus as a political threat, as an anarchist, someone that wanted to overthrow the government. And if rioting were to result because of Jesus, and the Romans found out the Sadducees had an ability to contain Jesus and didn't do so, the Sadducees would be dead. So they felt that the Romans were going to retaliate and attack them or burn down the temple or do whatever in the event Jesus starts an uprising. They could care less if Jesus was considered the Messiah. The Sadducees didn't believe in Messianism anyway. That was really sad, you see. Why would the Romans want Jesus gone? Legally, the Romans were uncomfortable with him. He was gathering large crowds. Obviously, he disturbed the peace. He was preaching about a new kingdom, hung out with known zealots, and people were calling him Messiah. People were calling him king. Luke is the only gospel that portrays Pilate saying he wants nothing to do with Jesus. Send him off to Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas essentially mocks Jesus and sends Jesus back to Pilate. We don't know how historical that is. All we know is Luke's the only one that tells that story.
Was Herod unimpressed?
Pilate historically was known for actually executing untried prisoners. So the very fact that there's a trial between Pilate and Jesus is actually quite interesting.
That is interesting, isn't it?
One interesting story that comes out of the trial sequence of Jesus is this figure named Barabbas. Barabbas was imprisoned for apparently murdering someone during an insurrection. An insurrection is essentially a revolt. So traditionally, Barabbas is associated with the Zealot sect. Pilate says, it's part of my tradition at Passover that I will release for you a prisoner. That's kind of an interesting tradition. Now, Passover, of course, is a time of celebration where the Jews were liberated from slavery in Egypt. So I guess Pilate wanted to keep that tradition alive by letting criminals free. Whatever. So Pilate essentially asks the crowd, who do you want? Do you want me to free Jesus of Nazareth, or do you want me to free Barabbas? What's really interesting about the Barabbas account is his name, Barabbas. Abba being father, Bar being son. And who's the father in Scripture? God. Barabbas literally translates to son of God. Matthew actually tacks on another name before the name Barabbas. And that name that Matthew gives us is actually Jesus Barabbas. Whoa. So in Matthew's Gospel, Pilate would say, do you want me to free Jesus of Nazareth, or do you want me to free Jesus Barabbas? In other words, do you want Jesus, Son of God, or do you want Jesus, Son of God? And the Jewish people have to make a decision. Which Jesus, Son of God, do they want to back? In other words, which Jesus, Son of God, is their Messiah? Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas? Ultimately, the Jews yell out, give us Barabbas. The Jewish crowds make the decision to back the military Messiah, to back the zealot. Remember earlier, Messianism. The Messiah was going to be a warrior. The Messiah was going to be a hero who liberates the Jews from foreign power. Barabbas already has an insurrection underneath his belt. Jesus was the opposite. So at that point in history, the Jews had to decide which type of Messiah do we want to follow. We want the one who's the military hero. They think that murderer is the true Messiah, which gives us new insight about when the soldier at the foot of Jesus' cross in Mark's gospel, after Jesus dies, looks up to Jesus, looks up to the cross and says, "This truly is the Son of God." I think the emphasis in that statement should be this. This here, this man truly was the Son of God. Not that other guy that they let free. Not the murderer. The murderer Messiah wasn't the true Son of God. That was a false Son of God. That was a false God. This here. And what's interesting is that, Mark's audience is Gentile. The soldier is a Gentile, obviously. The Gentile is the one that says, this truly is the Messiah. And the Jews were like, that's the Messiah. So I think that's a commentary that Mark is trying to say, that the Gentiles are truly recognizing who the Son of God is, and the Jews are following their old way of thinking.